Good morning. I'm Yolanda Olmedo, and now we're going to talk a little bit about forensic analysis. What is it? Where can it be used? The aim of this is to give you a general idea of the entire process of forensic analysis. We're going to look at some tools and some ideas so that if you have never looked at forensic analysis before, they'll get a basic idea of it. I'm a security engineer. I work for a Valencian company that specializes in cybersecurity, and I especially in response to incidents. I am involved in the CSIRT project here in the Valencian community, and we respond to security incidents in the public administration within the Valencian community. If anybody has any questions, then please go ahead. First of all, we have a brief introduction of this discipline, the different phases of forensic analysis, and we'll go into analysis and look at a practical case in Windows. And last of all, a brief mention of the reports, the structures that they need to have, and everything that we need to take into account. So, digital forensics, there are different definitions for this, but they all come down to the same thing, which is investigation of a system in an exhaustive manner when you have a suspicion or a confirmation that it has been compromised. Because you think there is going to be a cyber attack and you need information about that system. There are two possible environments for this: response to incidents and also for legal cases. It can be applied to both cases here, but here we're going to talk about response to incidents, and I'm not going to cover the legal side. I might just mention it as we go through, but I won't go into the legal side of it. So what scenarios can we come across in order to need to do this analysis? So these are crimes on the internet using systems or technological networks, and fraud online, such as industrial espionage, for example, where information is being stolen from the competition, from companies, from governments, and the purpose of this is both political and financial. We can even find it even in more particular cases, such as, for example, if we have a smartwatch that has been used as a test, and often they have actually been used in legal cases as proof. And in this particular case that I'm thinking of, it was to determine who was a murderer. We also have the Amazon Alexa case that was used in court. So we have different scenarios where we have different pieces of proof, but they all come down to the same thing. It's having proof of something that is going on in a system in order to resolve a situation, an incident or similar. Digital forensic incident response is a term that's very much linked to forensics in the digital world. And very graphically you can see here the firemen that are going to a place where there has been a fire and an accident, and they go in there to try and control the fire and resolve the situation. So a person in a DFIR team is an equivalent to these firemen, but in the digital world. DFIR personnel would go to an incident, physically go there and find out information about an incident, analyze all the information that person can receive, and issue a report. So we have the fire personnel in the first instance in the actual out there in the world, and DFIR in the digital world. So we need evidence. So what is evidence? We could say it is an element that stores information, digital information, and this could be useful to resolve a given case. For example, a hard disk, RAM, locks, firewalls, an image, a video, an audio recording, a camera, a CD, a DVD, a pen drive. All of these are pieces of evidence, digital evidence, and we can use them in order to resolve a case that we are dealing with. So we also have the custody chain, or the chain of evidence in this field. It's a piece of paper that is filled in during the acquisition phase, and this contains all the information about the evidence. Who is the manufacturer, who is the serial number, a model of a device, who is collecting the evidence, who was present at the scene when the evidence was being collected, the actual location, the building, the room. All of this has to be taken down in this document. Where the evidence is being taken, if it's being taken to another place in order to analyze it. So where is all of that being taken to? So obviously the hash for all of the different pieces of advice. So, and what is the purpose of this document then? To guarantee the integrity and the authenticity and the traceability of all the pieces of evidence. So that when we analyze all of this evidence, we can be sure that this is the same evidence that was collected at the scene. In a legal case, it's absolutely necessary, and if we don't present a document of this kind, or if the chain of custody is broken, then that is not acceptable whatsoever in a legal case. Obviously, this is a very recommendable process when you're responding to an incident. So the objective is to answer a number of questions. An analyst will have a number of questions, and we have to find the answers to those questions. The most common ones is what has happened, who did that on that computer, on that device, when did it happen, and how did it happen. This is probably the most difficult of all the questions. Everybody wants to know who did it, but it's very difficult to answer the who question. And we also have to be aware of the fact that you can't always answer all the questions, because you might not have enough evidence in order to answer those questions. There can be some changes in the evidence, or something might break in that chain, in that process, and this stops us from having the answers to these questions. Before you go into an investigation process, it's very important that you have a specific timeline for that investigation process. Because if we start looking like crazy through a disk, then it's like looking for a needle in a haystack. There's a lot of information on a disk, and if we start looking for the answer to our questions without having a specific time frame in which to work, then it's almost impossible. We have to set out our time frame. What is the scope of the investigation? What are we trying to find out? Anything beyond the scope of those questions is something that we do not need to deal with. Our objective is to reconstruct the timeline, what happened in the system in a sequential manner. We need to know what happened in the system, and also so that the reader, the person who's going to read our report, will also understand what happened. I'm going to mention some good practices when we're doing forensic investigation. And one of these good practices is having 2 copies of everything that we have. We have our original piece of evidence, obviously, anything that has been compromised or an object, and we do a clone and then a second clone. So we always work using the copy. We never work on the original, because we could alter that by mistake and then we've ruined our piece of evidence. So we work on the copy, and then we also have a second copy, because if we're working on the copy and we alter that as well, then at least we would have a backup. So if we go into paranoia level, then we can go on and on and on. But obviously we have to take into account the size and the space that all of these copies would take up. We have to take this into account when we're working. You always need to use also light tools. What do I mean? The most critical part in the analysis is acquisition. When you get your pieces of evidence, we can make a mistake in this process and get rid of a piece of information that would be of interest. So during this acquisition process, we have to interact, obviously, with the device, the piece of equipment from which we need to take the evidence. So the tools that we use in that process need to be as light as possible. They must not take up a lot of space in terms of memory, so that when we use that tool to make a clone, for example, it needs to take up a little bit of space so that we alter the system as little as possible. We can clone a disk or a RAM, and obviously we don't do that on the actual disk that we want to get the evidence from, because otherwise we're tampering with the evidence. We can connect with a USB, for example, or to clone over a network, which would be the best way of doing that. Another recommendation when we're responding to an incident is to not analyze an equipment using an antivirus. This might not make sense initially, but from a forensics point of view, it's what you have to do. Because if we want to acquire the evidence, the proof from that system, I want to see that malware and I want to be able to analyze it. I want to see what the capacity of that is. I want to see the capacity of its ransom, of the encryption, if there's any vulnerabilities there, if there are any credentials, and I want to see that malware and I need it. So if I don't do it in that way, then I'm getting rid of and tampering with my proof. You take your pieces of evidence and you remove it from the device, but of course you've got to get your proof and collect that and save it. So if we come across malware during an analysis, then we mustn't share that sample on a platform, on ARN platforms. I'll give you an example. Imagine a company that has suffered a direct attack. There is malware specifically for that company. So as an analyst, if I come across the malware, if I come across the infection, if I upload that to the virus total, then if we are a direct objective as a result of that attack and we collect that evidence, then the attackers are going to know that we've found that issue. And so their behavior of the attackers will change. So what we need to do is actually monitor the system, and based on the fact that we know that there's been an issue, but we monitor it in such a way that we take the techniques And this is what hurts the attackers the most. When we get to the highest level, this is where most damage can be done. So we don't need to upload the samples. The hash, we can check that with virus total to see that it's an existing sample. Another good practice is to get all of the pieces of evidence that we can. We have to measure the scope and find out what systems have been affected by an attack. And we have to be able to look not only at the attack system, but any other interaction with other systems, if there are any files, if there's a database, whatever. So we have to define the scope. If there are logs from the firewall, we have to be able to get those logs and have access to the database and so on. So the more pieces of proof that you have, the better. If you later don't need them, at least you've got them. You can eliminate and decide which are the best and most important. But it's better than going through the process and then finding out that, actually I'm going through this, but I don't have the pieces of evidence that I need. Oh, we haven't got the firewall. Oh, I needed that. I haven't got the deposit. So we end up being a bit lost there. So we need to have lines of investigation on one side, and if we can't work with one, then we need to have other options that we can work with, so that we can see the impact of an attack. A personal good practice that I recommend is to document everything, right from the start of the investigation to the end. So the acquisition phase is the most critical one, and during this phase I would even recommend executing, getting to the location, picking up the pieces of evidence, and if we want to see volatile evidence, then we write down on a piece of paper, wherever you want. At 9 a.m. we started working, we executed this tool. We began with the acquisition of the RAM. At 9:15 the tool gave an error. And we note all of this down on a piece of paper. 9:16 we executed the tool and we began to collect the evidence. At 10 o'clock everything finished correctly. So all of this process and all of this information needs to be put into the report. And this will help us when we're doing our analysis as well. Because you think, oh, what time did I do that analysis? And when did I do the acquisition? What time was it? This information will be very, very useful to you. So make sure you write everything down. And when you're doing your analysis, also write down what you want to analyze. During this forensic analysis, it tends to go on for a while, and you collect a lot of information. And sometimes when I'm doing something is going on, well, I'm going on to another task. And whilst that's going on, I'll go on to another task. So I like to have a checklist, analyzing the RAM, analyzing the processes, and I tick everything off as I go. And I take a look at everything that I've already ticked off, and I look at what's pending.
And here we have some Linux distributions, which are very widely used in forensics. Kane and Sift are the ones I personally use most, but Deft and Paladin are as good as well. And actually, Paladin, to acquire drives, it has a very important option when we clone drives. It allows us to clone two at the same time. We'll see what that is later, but this is a very interesting option. So this was the introduction so far. Now we have the concept of what forensic analysis is, where it can be applied. And now we're going to talk about the stages. There are three general stages: identifying and acquiring evidence, preserving that evidence, analyzing, and writing the report. This is a very, very general approach. Now we're going to look into acquisition first, acquisition and identification. This could be scene that we find ourselves with when we go to acquire evidence, and we find tablet, computer, a mobile phone, pen drive, CDs, anything. So as I was saying before, let's make sure that we identify the ones we need for our investigation. Let's find the relationship that might be between them and start the acquisition stage. Identify them with a sticker, with a serial number, everything. Now, once we have them identified, we will start our acquisition stage. We will always go from more volatile to less volatile. Whatever can be lost in the system, in seconds, and what will stay in the system. We are always going to take a picture when it is a computer, for example. Take a snapshot of the screen. Obviously, if it's on. So if it's on, we take a snapshot of the screen. We take a picture, make sure that it's not blurred, that we can see the time, the date, everything, and then we start getting the volatile evidence. We start with our processes, we check the DLLs, the logged in users, all the volatile information that we might lose, and then we go on to the RAM. So once we have all the volatile elements, we go to the non-volatile elements, which is the drive. And here what is recommended to do, although many people don't really like this procedure, is to unplug the cable, just pull the cable, turn the computer off, and then clone the drive. And why is this so? Because if we shut the computer down in the usual way, just shut down, then the system starts writing many things on the drive, and that's what we don't want, because we want the system exactly as it was when we found it. We don't want it to be overwritten, or for example, when it comes to malware, if it detects that the system is going to be shut down, it eliminates itself and we lose it. Yeah, so we have to just unplug. If it's laptop, then just take the battery off and turn the computer off, and that's when you clone the drive. And then finally, with pen drives, CDs, locks, etc., that's the last thing that you would acquire. So when we want to acquire volatile evidence, process is very important. Network connections that can be lost in seconds. So we should open a CMD and execute a number of instructions on that CMD, which will allow us to get the evidence that we can lose very, very quickly. For example, network connections, as we were saying, we would have a series of instructions that we would save. Each of these instructions we would save on a TXT file. We execute the command and we save the result in a TXT file. So these actions we're going to be executing from an external drive, obviously. Sorry, we're going to save them on an external drive, not on the local drive that we are going to analyze. For example, the processes as well, scheduled tasks, services, logged in users, the history, the CMD history, shared folders, network units, everything. So what do we do with all these instructions? We just put them on a script, .bat script. That .bat file will be saved on our incident response disk, and then we execute the file. We get all the volatile evidence, and in just a few seconds we have useful and relevant information for the case. Next thing, we would go onto the RAM. Dumpit is a very widely used tool. There are many tools, but this is very widely used. This is one of them. So basically, we would just execute it from our external drive. We get the acquisition done, and how does this happen? We take the whole RAM of the drive and we save it to a file, which is what we're going to analyze afterwards. And that single file is going to have the whole contents of the RAM. This is just to show you how Dumpit works. Once the process is done, you can see here at the end we have laptop, blah, 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 DMP. Yeah, so you have all the information in just one file. Now, it could happen that when you are doing incident response, you might not want to clone the drive because it's not necessary, or because of any reason you have, because all we want to do is just to resolve the incident and we don't need to clone it because it takes too long or it uses up too much space. So it could happen that we would need to do a live analysis of the machine, that we would have to interact with the machine that's been compromised. It is not recommended to use native tools to the OS because some malware can hide from that evidence. If we show our Windows Task Manager, we see all the processes going on on Windows, right? But there is malware that can actually hide from that list, so you cannot see it. So what is recommended is to use third-party tools. Some which are very good is Netsoft and Sysinternus from Microsoft. And these tools would allow you to see all the processes, all the DLLs, all the services, the users, passwords, many things really. So this can give us a first picture and some initial information to respond to an incident earlier on. Now, concerning incident response, we have Triage, which is basically getting evidence to solve an incident, but without cloning the drive. So what these tools do, and here's a snapshot of Triage, and basically what it does is to take the fundamental elements from a forensics point of view for a Windows system. It gets the information and it saves all the information in a folder, and then we analyze the information contained in that folder. So what is this going to contain? It will have the system information, all the processes, the log, the Windows log and register. It will also acquire the RAM, the system logs, as we were saying, security copies, prefetching, which is something that we always analyze in forensics. So it's going to gather all the elements that are fundamental for forensic analysis, and this is much quicker than cloning the whole drive. It's faster and it takes up less space, because this is going to take up at least as much space as the RAM. So if we have an 8 GB RAM, then our folder is going to be 8 gigs as well, and then we'll have TXT and the register files, the logs files. This might turn into 11, 12 gigabytes of information. It's much more than what we get with these tools. So this is a good practice as well that we use for incident solving. And then we start acquiring non-volatile evidence. Postmortem is what we call it. We have already unplugged the machine from the electrical network, and we start cloning, which is an exact identical copy of the original. So if the original has something which is wrong, then the clone will have exactly the same thing which is wrong. How do we go about cloning? We have two types of tools, hardware and software. When it comes to hardware, I don't know if you've ever seen this sort of device. These are called cloners, and what these devices allow us to do is that we have our evidence here, the original, the one that we want to clone, and then here we would have the 2 copies that we can do at the same time, simultaneously. So we will have 2 exact copies of our original evidence simultaneously. This also allows to block writing in origin, so you are guaranteeing that the original evidence is never going to be altered. So this is more trustworthy, and this is of more value when, for example, you use it for a legal case, because if the judge sees that the cloning has been done with this sort of tools, then it's going to give it a lot of credibility. So it's not going to doubt that that evidence has been modified. Now, another option would be to use this device that you see here, which is a writing blocker. We would acquire the information through software. We would have a light CD and then DDD, DCFLD. But we would have this device. By the way, the thing with cloning simultaneously is really expensive. That is the only inconvenience. A cloner can be worth at least 2,000, 3,000 euros. So obviously, we need to have a flow of forensic analysis and use this device a lot in order for this to be a profitable investment. But this is another option that also helps, and it allows us to clone. We have the origin, we have the target, and we would be able to also block the writing in origin. Now, this cable would go to our forensic lab equipment. We start with a light CD, and then we would see the 3 devices that are connected, and then we could clone the information. And the third option is using software to clone, because we don't have either of those devices that I've just shown you, but we can still clone it. So we would start our computer with a live CD, and once we have the live CD, then we can see the USB units that we have connected, and then we could start acquiring evidence. How would we go about this? We have DCFLDD, and then we have the input device, and then we have the output device here, so it's image.dd. So the original drive we're going to save in a single file as well, which is the one we're going to analyze, and that is going to contain everything that's in the drive, both the space that is in use and that is not in use. It will contain absolutely everything. And this also allows us options like calculating the hash before doing the cloning and after doing the cloning, so that we can then afterwards compare and see that the evidence hasn't been altered when cloning it, or even just save the hash on a log afterwards. So these are all the evidence, volatile, non-volatile, and what comes next? Preserve them. Now, how do we preserve evidence? In order to do that, we need to calculate the hash, which is an alphanumeric chain, which allows us, or a string, which allows us to guarantee that evidence, that if only 1 byte is changed in that hash, in that string, that is going to change. So we calculate the hash, and we don't touch this anymore, ever again. Now, we've done everything right. We go on to our analysis, we've got our evidence, we've preserved it, and so we start analyzing. And where do we start here? The evidence we are going to, that I'm going to use on these slides belong to practical use case that we have for practice. It's not a real case, but it could be perfectly well a real case. So let's imagine the CEO of a company opens a document, and their computer starts doing weird things, and so they call us and say, oh, what's going on? I've just opened a document and now it's doing weird things. So we go there And obviously we want to respond to this incident, and we execute, for example, IR Triage, which we've seen before, or CILR, Raptor, any of those tools that we use for triage. We take the most relevant evidence to analyze them, and we have them, and we're going to analyze them. Now, amongst them, we have the RAM memory. That is the first thing that we always analyze. What do we have stored in our RAM memory? Almost everything in the system. Processes, services, DLLs, users, logged in users, passwords, system passwords, the register, the history, addresses, emails. We can also see hidden elements such as root keys. Almost everything is in the RAM. It's precious to be able to analyze the RAM when we have an incident. So we will talk about this CEO, who has opened a document, and the first thing we're going to do is analyze the RAM memory. Sorry, a little apart. In RAM, we have two files which are in the drive, but which also are RAMs. It's IBFIL and PET-file. And IBFIL has the RAM, so when we put computer to sleep, all the contents of the RAM are saved to the drive, so that when we start the computer again, if you've ever done it, then you've got everything, right? You've got all your browsers, everything that you had open. Why? Because it has taken all the contents of the RAM, and it has copied them to a drive file. And when the system starts again, it just takes that file and puts it on the RAM. So that could be also an object for investigation, the hibernation file. And another one is like a swap in Linux, and there we find the pages that have been taken from the memory and taken to the drive. And this could actually be interesting in an investigation as well, because in this case, the IBFIL file we can analyze with volatility, but not the other one. So we will need to get the strings, which is scarf that file, and see if we could extract any contents from that. And in Windows 10 it's called swap file, which is the same as page file. So first thing, we analyze the RAM memory, is what we're saying. And what do we have here? We use volatility, which is the tool most widely used to analyze RAM memories. We indicate -f memory.ram, and that is the RAM acquisition that we've done. Then the profile would be that of the machine that has been compromised, so not ours, obviously. And then here at the end, we write the command that it has to execute in volatility. Volatility has different plugins, and depending on the plugins that it's executing, it will return a result, a different result for the RAM. So pslist, this command, what it does is to extract a list of all the processes that are contained in that RAM. So on this column, we have all the processes with the offset. This is the identifier, process identifier, father process identifier, when it was created, when it finished. So what's difficult here is always to tell apart what is good from what is bad. We need to know our Windows processes very well, and in order to be able to tell, well, this is good or this isn't. Now, sometimes attackers know a lot, and what they do is they have camouflaged malware, and the name seems very, very, very similar to those of Windows, and you might not realize that there is malware there. So here, although I have it underlined here, we have vfggggg.exe, but I have never seen that process on Windows. I don't know about you. So it just lights something up in my head. It says, something's going on here, fishy. Now, 172, it's the ID. At least we have a file where we can start our analysis from. We have the identifier number, and we have a date. So we have a temporary time frame, so we can start our investigation. 7th April 2018, 8:45 a.m.
So what can we analyze with the RAM? We can analyze the network connections. The command is the same as the one from before. We have the plugin here, which is the volatility one. And we have TCP connections here, the IPs, the local IPs, and the external IPs, the ports, if there's any listening, if the connection is established, when it began, when the connection began, and we have quite a lot of information here. So what we need to do is look for the external connections that we have here. We have an external IP here, which is 30030. And here we have something else. Here we have a process, we have a date, we have an IP, which is our IOC. And we can look on a blacklist, see if it's on the blacklist. And what else would we do? So volatility allows us to take the process, take it out from the memory that we're using it, and take the disk to a laboratory, a forensics laboratory, so that we can analyze a process to see if it's malicious or not. We execute the tool, which is Memdump. We indicate the process, which is 2072, that we mentioned before, and we put it into the current directory. We put in, it says writing vfggggg.exe, and then we have a 2072 DMP here. So what do we do here? Do we open it all up? No, we calculate the hash using that file. We have the hash up here, 32, all that string along there. We consult it in the total results, and we are lucky because we have more information. It's previously been put up on there, and this has been detected by 9 antiviruses. So we have another piece of information here for our investigation, all related to this malicious file that has caused this infection on the piece of equipment. What else can we analyze? We can also calculate the strings. We can get the strings from the 2.72 RAM, and we can do a grep to get the strings that we're looking for, to get more IPs, more routers in the system, or whatever. Here we can see there's a PowerShell that is interesting, and then we've got a root down here. We've got app data, local temp. We could also look in the disk on the drive to see if there are any more malicious files. In this case, we have those two interesting pieces of information that could be useful to our investigation. We take information here. I don't know if you can see it very well. It's maybe a bit far away. It says number of processors 1, operating system, Windows, NT, path, which is system 32, the architecture of 32 bits, and so on and so on. So this malicious process also reads information from your system. What else could we do? We could also extract the record from Windows, the register, because when it's executing, it's being saved in the memory. So we could also do a dump of this. So the command is dump registry. What can we extract from there? We'll get the registers from security, from no name, from the users, depending on how many users there are, the SAM, the system, and so on. So each of these files are part of the register that we would also use for our investigation. Another essential element is the actual system of files. We're in Windows NT here. It allows up to 2.46 gigabytes. And then we have alternative flows to hide data. And then there are specific characteristics of the system. There are a number of files and pieces of data that an operation system needs in order to work properly, so that nothing goes wrong with it. So these files that we're talking about make up the file system. So here we have a number of files: MFT, log file, MFT, volume, attributes, and so on. Each of these files belongs to the system file. And in order to analyze them, we have to analyze the system and analyze each file. MFT is the master file table in Windows, so that everything is on the drive is in the MFT. There has to be an entry in the MFT for each file that is on the drive. So if we're looking for a file on the drive, it has to be in there, in the MFT. Log file, for example, is another file, and it stores transactions before they go on to the drive. When you make a change to a file, it goes to a log file, and then it goes into the system, so that if there is an error in the system, it can step back. And it's also of interest to analyze this file. And then we have the bitmap. It shows where the clusters are, the free and unused clusters. And the MFT is the most important thing. We need to analyze that. So when we clone the disk, we have a file. We end up with a file, if you remember. It has the output. We've saved it. We've saved an image, and we saved it as image DD in order to be able to open it. So we use a tool that's called FTK image. You can download this for free, and everybody can use this. We need to take that image that we've cloned. We'd have to open it up here, and then we have the full content of the drive. Our files, our data, the users, all the content of the drive, you can see it on here, and even the free space. So in the root directory, you have a number of attributes, the sitemap, the mirror for the MFT, and so on, the page file, the swap file. All of these files are part of the file system. We take the MFT in this particular case, and we can export it. We export it, save it in our lab, and analyze the MFT. If it's a binary file, then we can't open it. So in order to do so, we use an MFT tool, MFT2CSV. We take the MFT and put it into a system that can be read by people. So then we have a number of lines, a number of columns, and each line represents a file or a directory from that MFT. So each column has a property. We would select the MFT we want to analyze, the file that we were talking about. We analyze it, We press start. It's important to work always in UTC. First of all, we analyze the equipment and then we do the conversion. But first of all, we analyze all the logs and they all have to be in UTC. We analyze the MFT and we have our file, the CSV file. So how do we analyze this? We do this with a CIF from Linux, for example. We have a malicious file, we have a date, and we can use this to go further. We can have a look at that VFGGG file. So here I do a grep and I look for the VFGG in the MFT. And we have a match here. So this file has been written onto the drive. So that's great. We have more information now to use. We can see the creation date on the 7th of April at 8:44. So how do we look in the MFT? We know it's the 7th of April. Let's go back in time, see what happened before and see what happened afterwards. So we have a timeline for the options of what happened with the malware. We look for the date, the 7th of April at 8 in the morning. We look in the CSV in our MFT and we get another CSV with the result. It's much smaller and we can open it in Excel and it takes up a lot less space. So we're closing down the timeline for our investigation. So our file from the 7th of April, we open up in Excel. We separate it into columns and we can search through that more easily. So we've got the VFGGG, we've got the users and the creation date. We've got that over here. So what do? We look prior to that time to see what happened, to see how that file got there. We come across a document. If you've dealt with phishing before, then you'll realize that there's a patch that is often used in phishing and it's trying to cover a purchase order in this particular case, and the file was opened on a macro, the malware was downloaded and the piece of equipment was infected. So we have an HTA over here, which is in HTML, which really stands out. It's in the temporary files. It stands out as something that is malicious. In fact, it coincides with the date, 7th of April, a couple of minutes before this document appeared. So we've got quite a lot of things here now. What can we analyze? We can analyze the Prefetch in Windows. Anybody know what that is? You're not familiar with that? Maybe just one person out there, two? The Windows Prefetch is a characteristic used by Windows to execute tools more quickly. So when we open up our browser, Excel or whatever, the operating system monitors the system, that particular application, in order to see the DLLs that it's using, and that information is stored in a file so that next time we open Excel, the browser or whatever, it opens up more quickly. It's absolutely legitimate and it's available on Windows, and that happens in Windows. So each time it executes in the system, there is a prefetch. So if we analyze malware, we analyze the prefetch. There will be a prefetch file in the system. We analyze the prefetch. So where do we store all of this? We store it in this root, in the Windows directory, in a file called prefetch. And within that, there are a number of files which are .pf, and these are our prefetch files. So each time they are executed, each time an executable is executed, there is a file that's created in the system. It's created in the system, so where? In the MFT. So we can connect the data here and cross-check this data to see when it was executed in the system. So this is the way we analyze the prefetch and find out when this file was executed. So the prefetch in our particular case, and I'd just like to mention Windows 7 here to say that it can save up to 128 prefetch files, and it has data of the last time it was used, last time it was executed. In Windows 8, however, we have the last 8 times an application was executed. So tools that we can use to analyze are WinPrefetch and PECMD. So we analyze the prefetch on our directory. We go to the prefetch file. Oh, and it's empty. Why? Because it was an SSD drive. Windows presumes that they're fast enough that they don't need these files. So by default, it's an option that is not working on the system. Windows has determined that this tool does not need to be used on a SSD drive. But you can, let's take a look here now at a prefetching analysis. This is a tool called WinPrefetch, and these are the prefetch files when the prefetch was created, and this is the first time that it was executed on the system. When the file was modified, that's the last execution. We have the size, the process, the root, the number of times it has been executed, and the backdata. So as from Windows 8, we have the backdata for at least 8 times. So 22nd of May or the 22nd of November at 9:58, at 12 o'clock, and so on, is the data that we can see on here. We have the backdata from the last 8 times. So we can see all the resources from the DLLs used in that application. So we just open the prefetch file and we can analyze the prefetch using the WinPrefetch view. What else can we analyze? An essential element is the register. This is where the system saves everything, the network configuration, the users, the icons that are used in the applications. There is details of the USBs. It's very essential information in forensic analysis. And we have to do an analysis of the register every time we do an investigation. They are saved as keys with some values within those keys, and some of these are the user keys for the user of the machine. This gives information on the files and information on the hardware from the system. So how do we take this to the world of forensics? So it's in database format and saved in files. And those files are on the drive. They're in the root that I'm showing you. So Windows System32 config, and this is where we get all the passwords are saved in the SAM. and we have as many NT users as users on the system. So each user has his or her own configuration. So we have to analyze the NT user for the use that we're looking at and analyzing this particular case.
And so we specify here the routes where those files would be stored. We would export them, although as you can remember we could export them from the memory as well, and then we would analyze them. And how do we analyze the files in the registry? The most widely used tool is RegRipper. You can use it on a console and you can use it on Linux. Every little file of the ones that I was mentioning, system, SAM, security, those are called hives, by the way, just in case you read it afterwards in the documentation. So you've got hive file, which file you want to analyze, that is. So you choose the one you want to analyze. The report you would write on a TXT, just as with MFT, so you can then see it in a readable way for us. And then on profile, we would say what kind of hive it is. Is it system, is it SAM, is it security? And then you just click on RIP, and then it would patch the registry file and write it on a TXT. And then on that TXT, we can look for the information that we need. Another application which is very visual, very easy to use, is Windows Registry Recovery, where we can also open these hive files, and with a very visual menu here on the left we can see the information on the network, the applications that have been installed, the users. So this is a very visual and fast way of analyzing the registry. So what do we look for in our registry? Malware is usually hidden in three main places within the system. One is the registry. That means that it stays in the system. That means that when the machine is rebooted, the malware will be executed automatically. And in order to do that, it writes a key in Windows Registry. And where is that key in Windows Registry? In that route here. Current user, software, Microsoft Windows current version run. Here, in this key, is where the applications that are going to run the moment the system starts are written. So we have analyzed, we have our TXT, we open it with any editor we want, and so we look for the key that we've got here in NT user. And, well, there we go, we found VFGGG, so we've found persistence in the computer. That is one of the questions that forensics always ask. Is there persistence when there is an infection with malware? Yes, there is persistence because it has written the registry key such and such, and every time the system is rebooted, the malware is going to be executed. So here's another thing that we found of the trace that the malware has been leaving. Now, another element that can give us useful information is user assist. This is another registry key which stores the applications that a user has executed. If you remember when we were talking about Prefetch, the applications that are executed in the system will create a prefetch every time they're being executed. Now, the only downside is that prefetch does not say which user has executed that application. So we don't have the correlation. We know that VirtualBox has been executed, but it doesn't tell us which user. Prefetch doesn't. So user assist is within NT user, and we get hence the information about the applications that a certain user has executed. And so we use Registry Explorer that you can download as well as a tool. And now this key is codified with root 13, so if we open it with a normal registry editor, we're going to see many weird characters and we're not going to be able to read it because this is codified. But Registry Explorer, this tool, is really useful because it decodes the information automatically, and hence you can read the applications that have been executed. Now, with Registry Explorer, we open our NT user data, and we can see here that this user executed Outlook on 7th of April at 8:42. Now, this is another evidence, something that is already telling us that something is going on, because they opened the email, then the document, then there was persistence. So we're starting to see how it was executed. We could also check the USBs that have been connected to the machine. This is all stored in the registry. But we would only see the last connection of the USB, and this is all saved in system current control set, all the keys that you can see here. And then we've got a Stools USB to view and autopsy, and with these we can see the USBs that have been connected to the machine, because the CEO was in a rush and he wanted to store this document on his pen drive to see it at home. Now we're going to check whether he actually stored it on the pen drive, but we don't see any date that coincides with the date when it was infected, so in this case it was not saved onto a pen drive. Thank goodness for that. On this column we have the letter that has been assigned to the USB, to the pen drive, description, serial number when it was last connected to the machine. So we can find some evidence here as well. Now, Windows logs is another thing that we should analyze when doing forensics. And what do these logs store? Well, basically, when a user has started the system, when it has shut it down, whether there are remote users connected to the system, if a PowerShell has been executed, for example. And how do we analyze the event log? We could just open it with the Windows Event Viewer. So we would just export them on VTX, open them with an event log that we have now in our forensic lab. But it's always easier to use CSVs amongst others. I am very fond of these because they're really useful, and then we use parsers, but I'll talk about that later. So Windows 2003 and Windows XP had these this VT and VTX, and we have tools such as Event Viewer and Event Explorer, and this one EVT-CMT, where we indicate which EVT we want to analyze and the output, and then we get that output onto CSV, and then we use our Cain application and we do grep, and then we find the information. Another one is Log Parser, which is another Microsoft tool which allows to analyze EVT and EVTX, and the output is on CSV. So here we are sending an SQL query, and we ask for the record number, the time, the time frame, the event ID, origin, computer name, identifier, user identifier, and the strings, which would be all the strings of that log, all the description. And that we will save in another CSV that we are going to parse. Now, the CEO didn't have anything of relevance here on Windows events, so, well, this is research path that didn't really bring results. So what do we find? As I was saying earlier, we also find if there's lateral movement in a computer that has been compromised and is trying to exploit another vulnerability on Samba, for example. We would see that on event log, remote users, logged-in users in general, all that kind of information we would find in these files. And, of course, browsing is something else that we need to analyze when doing forensics. We're going to analyze the most commonly used: Internet Explorer, Chrome, Firefox, if it's a Windows environment. So where does Internet Explorer save the history? In XP and Windows 7 in a file that is called index.dat. There is actually a link to another file that saves the history and which is hidden, and it's saved in the route that you can see here at the bottom. Just so that you have these routes as reference. Where would you save the temporary files, cache, everything else here in Windows 7 and Windows XP? And in Windows 8 and above, it is saved in EDB database, which we can open with data view, for example, and we would have just one file containing everything. On this database, we would also have our tables with our columns, with our registers, and we would be able to analyze it really quickly using these tools. Now, when it comes to Firefox, it saves everything in an SQLite database and different SQLite databases. And we're going to have a places.sqlite for the history as well. You can just auto-complete that in the browser. Form history, SQLite, the cookies, the passwords, the certificates. So we would just take all those SQLites and we would open them with a database viewer. And where are these databases? In the routes that you can see here at the bottom of the slide. And Chrome is very, very similar to Firefox. You would have everything stored in a SQLite database, and we would open it with a database viewer. This is a bit small, but this is another tool that I was saying you about earlier, Browsing History View. And this allows us to see the history of all browsers. We can execute this tool, for example, when responding to incidents. We can do a live analysis, execute this tool and see the history of all the browsers executed in the system. So here in this column you can see the type of browser, then you see the URLs, the time they were visited, the user who was browsing. So in a very, very quickly manner, you can see the history of all the browsers in that system. Now, when it comes to SQLite, we could open it with DB browser, for example. So we would open the files I was saying you about, for example, places, and then we would run launch a query. For example, select a list from mod places, the table that we have chosen, and there we would have the whole history of Firefox. And depending on the query that you run, you would have the history for Firefox. Then you have time stop and start, last visit date. Here, this column is where we store all the data. The format is Unix, and if we run this query, we would see string of numbers, so we would know the date. So we would have to convert this to date time from unique epoch to UTC so that we can see it in a more readable format. So with SQL queries, we could see the browsing history of a certain user. As we were saying, the main objective of forensics is to reconstruct temporarily what has happened in a system. And we do this taking everything that we have analyzed and taking out its timeline. And for that we use different tools. with the file system from the memory, from Prefetch, with Prefetch, and when we calculate the timeline of each of them, then we would unify them, and then we would have the whole timeline for the system, and then we would know in chronological order what has happened. Now, how do we calculate the timeline? We had MFT, and we use Analyze MFT on Python, and we give it the file that we want to analyze, and then we will get the result in body format. When we analyze timelines, we have different outputs and we have different tools that we can use. In this case, body is 16 or 9 columns. Then there's different formats with 5 columns, for example. So depending on the tool that we're using, we will have a different kind of output. Now, in this case, we're going to unify everything on TLN, and this is 5 columns. So Analyze MFT will give us the output in body, but then we will reconvert it to TLN with body file. So we give it our MFT, which is the result from before, and then we add the name of the machine, and then we save it on a TLN format, so that when I have everything from the MFT, Prefetch, the registry, everything has the same format, and then I will have coherence and consistency in the columns for the parsing. And then we're going to calculate the timeline for the memory. One of the many things that volatility offers is calculating a memory's timeline. And the command that we would have to use is this one, timeliner. It's a plugin from volatility that calculates the memory's timeline, saves it to a TXT, and then uses body format. So just as we did before, I take this format, I pass it to TLN with the same command as before, but taking now the body from the memory instead of TLN. And finally, we do our Windows registry. We're going to parse it as well. In this case, we're going to use rectime from RecRipper. And we indicate here the hive, which is in this case an identification name. So this hive belongs to Antonio. In R, we have the registry, and then we save it to a TLN format, and the same for all the other software system SAM security. And that's how we would have our Windows registry in a TLN format. And then we would just compile and put everything together. We take our parse tool, we take all our TLNs, and we save the output to a CSV. I love CSVs. So we've got output -C, and we are indicating CSV. Timeline is all. We have memory, we have file system, and we have the registry. So we have our timeline here recreated. And now we can start analyzing that timeline and see in chronological order what happened in that system. Then we would add that timeline to the reports, and that would be it. Now, I wanted to show you this, but I don't have it here, but with Autopsy, with this tool, everything that we've been doing now, analyzing prefetching, analyzing user assist, analyzing the registry, the history, the documents that recently opened documents, we have been doing them one by one with different tools. But one tool that would allow us to do everything and at the same time is Autopsy. And I hear you saying, well, why didn't you start there? Yeah, well, otherwise you wouldn't have seen the whole process. So we just get Autopsy and we run the whole cloned drive. And so we have Autopsy with its menu on the left-hand side, browsing history, all the browsing history, user assist, one for every user, prefetching, everything we have from prefetching, event log, the same thing. Yeah, but there's always a but, isn't there? And the but here is that Autopsy is very, 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 very slow and it uses up a lot of resources. It is a free tool, which is very good, but it has the downside that it needs a lot of resources, at least 8 gigas just to execute. Recommended 16, by the way, and this is just RAM to execute autopsy. Just so that you get an idea, 20 gigas, which was the CTF that I was doing, I analyzed it with autopsy, and the 20 gigas from a cloned drive, which is almost nothing, took them 11 hours to analyze, okay, just so that you assess. I mean, it's really good because it even takes all the files that have been developed, but this is a matter of just pressing analyze, leave it there for the weekend, and when you come back, it will have done a 20%. If you're analyzing a 500 giga or a terabyte drive, then it is really complicated. There is another tool, OS Forensics. This is a very, very versatile tool. It works really well, but obviously you have to pay. But it works very well. It can help you a lot. Very similar to autopsy, but extremely faster than autopsy. It only takes minutes. Well, maybe not minutes, but maybe half an hour, 1 hour, and you have everything analyzed.
It's also a good option. I think it's $900,000 to purchase it. Within this field, it's not actually a lot of money, but it's something that you need to keep in mind. So, autopsy, you should try it just to see what it's like, see what results it gives you. And we've come to the report section now. We've done the analysis. We've seen the execution of everything that has gone on. So what do we need to document here? It's very important to document everything that goes on during the forensics process. Right from the identification part, when we find an incident, when we're notified of that incident, and maybe it's a user that calls us, the manager of a company, I've seen something strange, and I put all that in the report. We received a call at this time of day, and we were told this. All of this goes down into the report. So, how the incident was detected, all that kinds of information for the entire process, and particularly the acquisition process. So during the acquisition process, we also might have some interviews with management, for example. What were you doing at the time? You opened a document, were you browsing? Was it in a strange website? And you have a little interview with a person and with the affected users or the administration manager. And we'll see where the server is connected to what it is exposed, is there a firewall? All of that documentation is noted down, it's saved, and it's put into the report. The acquisition process, obviously the analysis part, each of the steps that we've gone through, the tools that we've used, if we've analyzed with a Prefetch, we did the Prefetch with this tool in this version, and we put all of this into the report. And of course, it has to be comprehensive. It has to cover all the questions. If you can't answer any of the questions that you initially had, then you have to put that in the report as well. There was persistence in the team, but there was no evidence to show that, then you don't put it in the report. You can write down there was no proof that there was persistence within the team. So you have to try and respond to all of the initial questions that you had. So in a general way, you can see here the structure of a report. You have the executive summary. So what goes in here, it's the part that your boss is going to read, of course. All of the technical part, I don't think they're going to read that. We put the case number in, we put in preliminary information, and the conclusions of the entire process. All of that goes into the executive summary. In how was the equipment compromised and so on. Then we have to go into the details of that identification, what was the route that it came through, the background to the situation and the incident, what caused this incident. That's basically what comes next. Then we have the part regarding the evidence, all the drives that we've got, the RAM memory, the logs, the firewall, if there's a proxy, and so on. We document all of that here with the corresponding hashes. And then we go into the technical side of the analysis. We would say and comment everything that we've done, and including everything that we've done that has not given us any result. We include that as well. We did this process, but we didn't find evidence of any execution because it was this particular type of drive and there was no evidence. We put all of that in. We put in all the technical side. We can talk AVWK here. We can talk about more technical terms in this section. And then we come to a number of conclusions, relevant facts that we've seen during our investigation, and a number of annexes that we might like to add. If I analyze the browser history, then I'm not going to put all of that into the report, but not the entire thing, and I'll put the entire thing then into the annexes. I include a demonstrative part of the browsing history in the report, but I put the full amount of information in the annexes. We can talk about also the methodology used by the attackers and put that in the annexes. If we're able to see the relationship with the attacker, then we can put that in there. The tactics that were used, the procedure that the attackers used during that attack, and last of all, a series of recommendations so that this situation doesn't come up again. So this is a little bit what I wanted to talk about this morning. Here are a number of links, number of references and resources regarding the tools. They are the ones that we've spoken about this morning are all included in here. You can look for them in Google, the FTK for the images, the autopsy, OS forensics. Remember that you have to pay for it. Sysinternals and Neosoft. Dump it to acquire RAM memory. We can use the RAM capturer for the RAM memory as well. Windows registry recovery for the registry. It had the graphic part, Reg Ripper, Registry Explorer, and the Win Prefetch views for the prefetching. NFTS log tracker. We didn't see it in today's example, but this is for tracking the log file in Windows. The jump lists, thumb batch, browsing history view. We also have carving tools such as Foremost and PhotoRec and Scarpa. That's not on here actually. IR triage for doing the triage on a system. BAM by Raptor, CYLR, volatility. We haven't talked about Linux systems today, but we need Lime for that in that particular case with Linux. And then a number of tools in GitHub. There are some interesting repositories. We have all of these tools. When we work in this field and you go into Prefetch on Google, you'll find any number of tools in there. I've quickly gone over some of them and some of the ones that are easy to use. But in order to do an analysis, there are many tools that you can use, many different ones. You don't just have to use the ones that I've mentioned. So in the GitHub repository, you will find any number of tools for analysis purposes. And since we began talking about firemen at the beginning of the presentation, what do they do when they're not putting out a fire? They're training. So in forensics, digital forensics, we need to do the same. When we're not working on incident, we're training in digital terms. And here are a number of tools and resources that you can use, which are practical tests, so that you can practice on and to improve your ability in forensics. That the ones that we looked at were taken from the CTF, from the university in Zaragoza. You can use that URL, and I would encourage you to have a look at that. In ENISA, on their webpage, they also have some interesting training options. And CIRCL forensics training from abroad, and you may already be familiar with this, but you have the CNNCTFS and Tenor as well. This is not only for forensics, but pen testing, network analysis, and so on. It covers many different themes. And I think I've got about 10 minutes left of time, available time, but we've come to the end of the presentation now. So if you do have any questions, please go ahead and ask me. Well, it must have been all very clear if you have no questions. Good morning. I see that when you have to analyze a case and there are so many different tools, I would like to ask how a team of forensic is organized, if it's in different teams and so on. There are generally a number of people involved in an incident during the acquisition stage. It's not a very good idea to have very many people because you just have to get the evidence and take it to the lab. So there might be just one or two people in that part. But in the analysis part, a number of people can be involved because not everybody knows how to do everything. I don't know much about malware, for example. I have some basic knowledge of malware, but I don't know how to do reversing, for example. So then other colleagues get involved in that, people who know more about that. So we have an ARM platform. We have to understand about ARM architecture or malware on this kind of platform. So in a team, you need several different people. It needs to be interdisciplinary, and each person deals with a different task. And we also need to diversify and do the analysis a little bit quicker whilst I'm doing something and I find a coded analysis in 7,000 different ways. Maybe another colleague can deal with that, or browser traffic can be dealt with by another colleague. So, yeah, there are several people involved, generally 4 or 5, easy. Good morning. You mentioned that Prefetch was used to see something quicker. Couldn't you go easier to the cache memory more quickly? Yes, you could use a cache for that, but what it does is to take all the files used by an application, the DLLs, and they're stored in a single file, so that each time Outlook is executed, it uses a number of DLLs and they're saved in a file, so they don't have to be saving them and looking for them each time. And so next time Outlook is used, then it works faster. Yeah, it's a kind of cache. Yep. We have a question over there on the other side. And again, back on the other side.
Hola, buenos días.
Good morning. Congratulations for your talk. I found it very interesting. I'd like to ask about a practical case in which there has been an incident, and above all in acquisition, in forensics, the crucial part and the custody chain. Should a company go to response to an incident and they were doing the acquisition of the evidence following the right path, and that person were to go to a second expert during a legal process, would the expert's information have more importance? No, the first person involved in the case would be the person that they would call to go to court and make a declaration. If there's another person involved, as long as the evidence is integral, then there should be no issue with that evidence. Because, well, yes, another person could deal with the evidence, but it would always be relevant as long as the chain is not broken. I don't know what you'd call it, but imagine if the person did not turn up to court, how could I ensure that the custody chain is real? That expert will always be accompanied by the judicial police or a lawyer. I can't go on my own for acquisition of evidence because there's nobody there to say that I've done it correctly. There has to be somebody going there along with you when you do that acquisition of information. So an expert doesn't go alone. And if that expert is no longer around, there's always a lawyer, a notary public, to say that the acquisition was done correctly. I hope I answered your question correctly. And over on the other side, there was a question. Good afternoon. I said good morning, some of you, but it's already the afternoon. Why forensic analysis and not pen testing? Do you mean for me? Yes. Well, just because I like finding out, and it's got a lot to do with films, and I like CSI, for example, and I like finding out what is going on, and I just find this interesting. Something has happened, we want to find out what went on. It's just something I like and enjoy. So on the whole, people like pen testing, but I personally find it okay. It's interesting, but I don't know if I can break or not break something, if there's a patch that's been applied. So there's a bit of a doubt there, but in forensics, you know that something has gone wrong. You either suspect it or you're pretty sure that something has happened, and then you go back in time to reconstruct the situation. It's like doing a puzzle. So I go in and think, I'm going to solve this puzzle. I've got these pieces, I've got the log analysis, I've got all my pieces, and I'm going to put them together in my puzzle and reconstruct the facts. Personally, it's an area of work that I really enjoy, and it's just for that reason I like finding out what has gone on. It's that curiosity side of things. Thank you very much.
Hola, buenos días.
Hello. We have been talking about Windows OS. There's been a tool for Linux, but how about Mac? In terms of OS security, are there tools to analyze them? Is it easier, more difficult? Well, usually the acquisition process changes a little bit, but you can also clone drives through Thunderbolt with Mac. And it is true that the tools for cloning are different, but the procedure is more or less the same. You have your evidence. You can use different tools, or you might have to use different tools because the original binary is different. The PS list, the files are different in Mac compared to event logs on Windows or registry on Windows. But the procedure is going to be more or less the same. The whole process is similar. But I mean, we could have another very, very long talk about Mac. Does it make it more difficult, this process, Mac being a closer OS? Well, to be honest, I have done Mac mostly for educational purposes, nowhere in real life. So I wouldn't be able to tell, but for educational purposes, when we've tried it, the difficulty is exactly the same. Thank you. Hello, my name is Pablo. Congratulations on your speech. It's been absolutely amazing. I was listening to you, and when you talked about RAM, I thought that RAM memory, the moment you turn the computer off, it is volatile, so you lose everything. So when we've been talking in class, our teacher has always mentioned it, and we have been debating it. How can you extract that information from the RAM, the data that you have been telling us about? The system has to be on. So if I shut the computer down, then it's all gone. I wouldn't be able to recover that data. I couldn't analyze, right? Well, you could try a little bit to see from PET file and LibreFil, if you have them, the two files I mentioned. LibreFil takes the memory and saves it to a disk when the system goes on hibernation, and then you've got the other file that gets the pages that from the memory when the memory is full. That's the only thing you could potentially use, but the actual RAM, you wouldn't have it, because if you turn it off, you lose it. So we can do the same thing for an SSD drive. Yeah, of course. But if you turn that off, you lose all the information. Well, you've got the drive. No, the information on the drive you have it, but you don't have the RAM. So the information on this SSD drive is not volatile. Hello. You have run a very systematic investigation, and I imagine that that's what you do in real life. And I was wondering whether you've ever found yourselves with a case where doing all of this you cannot find anything, and would you have to use more manual methodologies or something else to find something out? Yeah, it has been the case of running a forensics and not finding anything. Have you filtered information? No evidence. Is there persistence? No evidence. Is there prefetch? Well, we don't have the prefetch. Yes, it has happened. And what do you do then? Is it just dead? Well, in that case, you just say that you haven't found evidence in that machine for the scope of the analysis. It's usually cases that are very old. It's true that sometimes we get a forensics or we discover an incident and it's been years since the incident happened. So you start checking the prefetch from 5 years ago and you say, well, there's nothing here. Or, you know, everything that's from 5 years ago, it's really difficult to find out. So that, yeah, it is highly probable that you can find evidence, which is why it is very important to act really quickly when there's an incident. Thank you. Done? Oh, there's another question there. They're at the back. Thank you very much for your presentation. I just wanted to ask a question. From SSD drives, there's a layer that the OS is seeing, but then there's another mechanism in the background so as to not override the cells too much. Do you ever have to analyze them at low level, or you just get the vision from the OS? So if you don't find evidence, can you go lower to see if there's something there? The data that have not been overwritten. In theory, but I have to be truthful, I have never seen myself an SSD done in real life anyway, only in theory. But the theory is that you would get to exactly the same point. But I'm not sure. I'm sorry. I imagine it would be so. But I don't know to which layer you could go down. Thank you. What characteristics would a case have to have for forensics to be run and not just use the antivirus? It's usually when there's some sensitivity. If I have a machine with malware, we don't need a forensics analysis because it's not going to have much impact. But it really depends on the impact the incident has, and especially the person who has suffered or has been the victim of the incident, whether it's a managing director or if it's a critical machine with confidential information, for example. For example, in the energy, electrics, healthcare industries, information is very, very critical usually, and you would need a forensics analysis. Or maybe if it's a user that you suspect might have been, stolen corporate information, or if they have uploaded corporate information on OneDrive, Dropbox, and has stolen information from there. It's usually cases where there's some sensitivity, where there's something a bit higher. But usual malware, you don't run forensic analysis because it takes a really long time. Because with autopsy, is many hours, as we were saying, so that an investigation can actually last months. And if you have several machines which have been infected, or if it's a server with different backups, you also have to analyze the backups. So it does take a really, really long time, loads of dedication, loads of work, and it obviously has to be something which is of importance, say, to run a forensics analysis.
Queda una.
Any more questions? Hello. I was wondering, when you run the analysis, you find the malware or whatever it is, and you have everything. What do you do with the hard drive of the victim afterwards? Do you see what I mean? I mean, do you format that hard drive? Do you analyze all the networks in the company, or? No, we don't analyze the network for the whole company, depending on the impact it has, obviously. But usually what you do is you isolate it, you copy it, you analyze it, and once you've solved the case, then you just format the hard drive, you do secure delete, then you overwrite the whole drive with zeros or random writing, and then just do it. But if it's a legal process, obviously, then the original is kept by a notary or by a lawyer. But in a normal incident, you just isolate it, and then you just format it. And how about if the drive has something important? Would you lose it? some important information. Well, that's why you should do security copies. It's a very good practice, you know, concerning security, to have security copies. Hello. I was wondering whether in cases where you've had to analyze a hard drive and there's something which has been damaged, have you been able to recover the damaged sectors with methods or other companies that do that? Have you been able to recover them anyway? Something which is important for the case. Because even before catching the user or the company, they have formatted it or they have damaged it in some way in order to prevent you from getting the information. Well, you could recover it as well. There are actually tools that allow you to recover information from a hard drive which has been damaged, and there's actually malware that on purpose says, well, this sector, just mark it as damaged and I will hide there. And so the OS will say, oh, I've got a damaged sector, so I'm not going to write there, but the malware is actually hidden in that sector. So yeah, there are tools to see that information. Thank you. Well, if there are no further questions, I think after this bombardment with questions, we should give her a grand applause. Thank you, but if you do have more questions, you've got my contact details and just bombard my email. I think it's been a success. Thank you so much, Yolanda, for being here for this wonderful talk. And I see all of you back here in 2 hours with Daniel Garcia. Enjoy your meal.